here with all of you. I am just delighted to be here with you to really introduce this ebook, which is called The Courage to Lead. And I have to tell you, this was a real, kind of labor of love for me. And so tonight, we're going to just overview some of the topics that are covered in The Courage to Lead. We'll talk about what does it mean to be a transformational literacy leader? And why is the implementation science so critical to our understanding of transformational leadership? We'll talk about things that are in the book, tips and checklists and guidance around the phases of implementation. And I'll also share with you which one of the aspects of this book, which I really think is critical, is lessons from successful literacy leaders. You know, people that have gone through a journey, and their tips and advice for all of you who are tuning in and thinking about, the courage to lead and making sure that we all have that courage to persevere, to deliver on this promise that is most important for our students. So just a quick kind of orientation to the book. So The Courage to Lead is a book that I really wrote to honor and uplift literacy leaders. I have had the opportunity in my long career in education to work with incredible, inspiring leaders and to mentor with people who have been transformational to me in my own journey and who I have watched make a transformational journey to improve outcomes for our students in the areas of literacy. And I'm so grateful. Many of them have contributed to this book. So there's a QR code here. Barbara's going to put the link in the chat so that you can have this book for yourself, electronic copy of this book for yourself. So the book is really divided into three sections. One is the first section, which is about just the importance of literacy leadership. I am convinced when we think about all of the efforts that we have made over decades, when we haven't moved the needle, it's because there hasn't been strong, consistent leadership. And so I want to uplift and honor and applaud leaders and really magnify the work that they do. And in the first section, I'll also kind of introduce the implementation science. So tonight, I'll just give you a brief glimpse of that, but that's really the first part of the book. The second part of the book goes into the phases of implementation. You know, we all know that implementation is not a quick fix. You know, it's not an immediate answer. It's a multi-year journey, starting with a vision and ending with a full implementation of that vision. And so the book goes into each of those phases, and I'm going to touch on those tonight, but it also gives specific, what I call leader moves, like to be a courageous leader in each of these phases. What are some leader moves that you might want to consider as you go through implementation? The third section is really wonderful. It's just packed with words of wisdom from courageous leaders and prominent leaders in the field. Mitchell Brookins writes a piece on cultural responsiveness. Antonia Fierro writes a piece on teacher preparation for ELs. We've profiled many courageous leaders in this third section, and we've also profiled some school districts that have had some great success. So anyway, that's kind of, in a nutshell, the overview of the book, and I'll delve into some pieces of that tonight. Now, why? Let's go back to the why behind the book. So as I mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work with, mentor with, learn from many courageous leaders. And over the past couple of years in my work with 95% Group, I have had the opportunity to meet with leadership teams. And oftentimes I ask them, this is a question I ask, as a leader, what question do you need to ask yourself, or do you need to ask your school community in order to start a transformational process in literacy? And I'm just going to share with you a couple of charts that I just did took a photo from some of these convenings. I asked them again, what are key questions to ask yourselves to lead change? And I'm going to pause here because I want you to read these questions that people come up with in terms of their self-examination as they start leading literacy. All right. So this is just a snapshot of some of the questions that these courageous leaders are asking themselves to really lead the charge of literacy transformation. And I love, so many of them get kind of at what are our deeply held beliefs? Do we not just have the skill, but do we also have the will? What is our mission? What do we believe? So it's really important that courageous leaders kind of look at underlying beliefs about children and about how children learn and about how we can be of service to their own literacy development. And with that in mind, I wanted to share with you that Maryanne Wolf was kind enough to write the foreword to this book. And many of you know her, and she's one of my very favorite people in the world. And she also, to me, is a real strong voice in advocacy. You probably know her books, Proust and the Squid and Reader Come Home. And in her foreword, she basically said, I want to honor the fact that literacy begins, and I love this phrase, under the crook of an arm. Literacy doesn't start when kids walk into school. It really starts with the eye contact and the murmuring and the voicing that we do with our babies and the reading and all those things that we do under the crook of an arm. But then she says, once our students start school, our main focus is we are connectors. We are first and foremost connecting the parts of the brain that start our children on their journey to access the written code, right? We're helping students make those connections. And then I love what she says about keeping the end in mind. Reading isn't just about getting the text off the page. We want our kids to be competent readers, of course, but we want them to be able to read deeply in order to build perspective taking, build empathy, build discernment, build critical analysis, contemplative processing, and generative thinking. And I appreciate her big view of what it means to lead a literate life and how it begins with us making those connections. The other thing she says on the right-hand part of this slide is the leaders in this book will never, never be known by the masses, but they will affect, often as not, invisibly, both the lives of countless children and also the lives of these children will, in their turn, affect. And I want to honor all of you in the work that you do. Many of us are engaged in this work because it is a labor of love. It is a calling. And I'm sure many of you feel that. And you may not be known by the masses, but the effect you have is profound. So when we think about leadership in literacy, one thing I like to remember is that all of us as leaders know that literacy is a human right that can and must be guaranteed to all of our students. Because the truth is, if we don't get literacy right, we don't get anything right. Yeah. So if you have the book, if you have an e-copy of the book and you want to follow along, this next piece is on page 10 of the Courage to Lead book. And this is really just defining what I define as a courageous leader. A courageous leader knows that all means all. That's our objective, is to ensure literacy for all of our students and know that literacy is the foundation, not just for school, but success beyond school. And as leaders, we have to cultivate that vision and create a culture for problem solving so that we can attack this as a team of people invested in our kids, right? It's not Miss Stewart's kids or Miss Patterson's kids. It's all of our kids. So some of you tuning in tonight might be on a journey of change to try to change outcomes for the students. I'm guessing maybe that's why you joined the webinar tonight. So if that's the case, you may be on a journey of what I call transformational change. And this is where, we're looking at a fundamental shift in the way things are done. We're not just looking at tweaking this or adding that or taking out, something. We're looking at a transformative change that creates a new system in how we approach literacy learning and how we approach teaching. So transformational is not just transactional, right? Transformational is, first and foremost, it's collaborative. And I'm going to use this word a lot tonight. It's collaborative problem solving. This is not a leader who comes in and dictates what has to happen. Leaders provide the vision and set the stage for that collaboration of all invested parties. I also think it's really critical that we start by looking at the implementation science. Now, if some of you joined the webinar that I recently did with Terry Noland, some of the information I'm now going to talk about is a little bit of what we reviewed in my recent webinar with Terry. But hang in there because it bears repeating, because it really sets the context for the courage to lead, right? So let's talk about implementation science for just a few minutes. So implementation science essentially is made up of the methods or techniques that enhance adoption, implementation, and sustainability of an intervention. And by the way, when we refer to intervention, we're not talking about tier 2 intervention. We're talking more broadly like an innovation, right? So think of it like an innovation or something you're adopting. So the implementation science identifies the changes that must occur within that system so that educators can be successful with an innovation or a program or a practice, right? So another way to look at it is like this. Implementation science is really critical because we've got this body of research called the science of reading. But there is a disconnect between that body of research and what's actually happening in classrooms. And Mark Seidenberg, some of you might know his book, Language at the Speed of Sight. He talks a lot about this. What do we need to bridge so that that research can be actualized into practice? And the implementation science can really provide that bridge between research and practice. Now, why is there a disconnect between research and practice? So here's 4 reasons that I've identified that I think really are contributing to a gap between research and practice. So one is misalignment. That would be, for example, if we picked something, a program or a practice that really doesn't fit the needs of the students that we're serving, right? So misalignment is one reason that there's a gap. Another reason there's a gap is because let's say that we do have a good program or we do have good practice or we do have a good innovation, but it's just not being used as intended. Some people call this fidelity. I tend to call it integrity because I think sometimes fidelity conjures up this idea of a rigid adherence to a program or a script. Integrity, to me, means that we want to use a program or use a practice as it is intended, with always intention focused on the student rather than the program itself. How about sustainability? I see this a lot. Many schools or districts, they want to start a transformative journey, but then the next new shiny object comes along and there's multiple competing programs, or sometimes it's a new priority or a change in leadership that prevents that sustainability. And finally, maybe one of the gaps that exists is we can't scale the innovation. We see islands of excellence, but we don't see systemic, widespread adoption from school to school or classroom to classroom, right? So these are some potential gaps in implementation. So just drop in the chat if any of you see any of these research to practice gaps that you're facing. Just put a 1, 2, 3, or 4 if you've seen a research to practice gap in your own experience, in your own school or district. And if you see more than one, go ahead, put more than one. So it looks like we've got, yeah, Lisa says all of them. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it looks like all of you can relate to this. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of them all. Yep. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And here's one thing I want you to remember as you're putting in those numbers. There is no shame and no blame here. This is not about blaming anybody. This is about identifying the gaps so that we can overcome them in our work. And again, I think implementation science is a key factor in this. So in the Courage to Lead on page 13, I go into this idea, and this was published in Perspectives back in 2018, that if we don't have clearly defined implementation teams and methods and goals, it can take 17 years to move half of an intended new initiative into routine practice. So that explains a lot when I read that statistic about why sometimes change is so slow to manifest in our schools and classrooms. Whereas if we have clearly defined implementation, goals, teams, methods, then we can move the needle 80% in 3 years. I want to say something too. Much of the implementation science comes from the health field, from the medical field. And so the implementation science is not just unique to education. It really does go across fields. And so one of the things we know, first of all, let's pause here and just think about this, right? I don't know about y'all, but I don't have 17 years left to to get to 50%, right? We got to get the job done. So part of that, again, take note, clearly defined methods, implementation teams, right? Those are things that are big factors that we address in the Courage to Lead. This, I think, is an equation that I've kind of adapted from the National Implementation Research Network, or NIRN, NIRN. They've got a really great hub that you can check into. Just check out NIRN. It reminds me of the simple view of reading because it's multiplicative, and all of you, I bet, tuning in tonight can relate to the simple view of reading. So all of these factors have to be integrated in order to reach our outcomes. So I'm going to give you some examples. What outcomes do we want for our students? Well, we probably want educational equity and literacy for all. I'm guessing we would all agree upon that. So what factors do we need to get there? Well, we need effective practice. So that's evidence-aligned instruction. We need effective implementation. That is support for that effective instruction, and we need enabling context. Enabling context means the environment or the setting. Now, let me drill down even further. Evidence-aligned instruction would be those principles of instruction coupled with effective resources, effective curriculum resources. Supports would be things like implementation teams and systems and professional learning and ongoing coaching. And one of the key aspects of environment and setting is literacy leadership. Now, I'm going to take a mythical school. Let's, ABC, school ABC. And let's say school ABC is kind of gauging their compliance to these different factors. So let's say school ABC says effective practice. Yeah, we've adopted kind of science of reading methodology, but we're still using a lot of level text because we got a book room. We got to use the text. So we're going to give ourselves about an 80% on that. Okay, effective implementation. We've got professional learning, but coaching, we just can't afford that. So we're going to give ourselves a 50% compliance on this factor. And literacy leadership, we've got some leaders that are on board, but we also have some leaders who aren't. We've had a big leadership turnover. So we're going to give ourselves a 60% on that. Well, do the math. And you've got about a 24, in school ABC has about a 24% chance of being effectively reaching their socially significant outcomes. So in the Courage to Lead, we cover all of these factors, and we really look at these factors through what are called the phases of implementation. So if you're able to follow along with the book, on page 17, you'll see this graphic. And this graphic is designed to represent kind of the journey through the phases of implementation. And I want to note why it looks the way it looks, why it's got that, up and down, up and down. The road starts off the page and it continues past the page because the journey that we take starts from where we are and continues on, right? It's also a windy road because the implementation journey isn't a straightforward path. It's filled with twists and turns and sometimes detours and off-ramps and on-ramps. And the dots along the way that you see on this graphic represent some of the milestones along the phases of implementation. Now, again, in tonight's webinar, we're just going to do an overview of this, but know that in subsequent webinars, we'll be offering a deeper dive into some of these. Now, along the bottom, what you see are the phases of implementation, and this was adapted as well because in the typical phases of implementation, you'll see 4: exploration, installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. I took sustainability as its own phase because I think securing long-term commitment and continued growth really deserves its own attention and its own deliberate, purposeful intention. So in this graphic, what you'll see is you'll see those 5 phases, and then some of the tasks that we undertake throughout each of these phases. And I want you to know that, it was adapted from these experts that you see listed here. And what you'll notice too is that across the bottom, I've put 2 to 4 plus years. So please know that the implementation journey is not something that happens overnight. And that's why we have to, stay the course. I recently wrote an article about the NAEP scores, and some of you know that the NAEP scores did not show improvements, and many people are like, oh my gosh, is that the science of reading's fault? Do we need to jump ship? And the truth is we've just started that journey. The truth is we've just started that journey. We've got to stay the course and keep a relentless focus on what we know is the right thing to do. So I'm going to go through each of these phases and just give you a glimpse of some of the tips and checklists and words of wisdom from each of these phases. So let's start with the exploration phase. During the exploration phase, that's when we as leaders identify a need for change. We strive toward a shared vision. We start exploring some interventions and solutions. For example, perhaps one of the explorations is you're looking for a new program. You're looking for a new resource to use for literacy. In the exploration phase, you're finding some champions, the early adopters, the people that want to join perhaps your implementation team. And you're assessing the readiness of your school community and trying to identify what will be some blockers. You have to pre-identify those so that you can make a plan for overcoming those. So let's just talk a little bit about this first one, striving for a shared vision. As I mentioned before, part of this book is magnifying the work of some courageous leaders. And I think we can all agree that Louisa Moats is probably one of the most courageous literacy leaders that we know. And her tips for us as leaders are to have that conviction you're doing the right thing, name your vision, and lead toward that vision, a relentless focus on that vision. The reason I'm putting a QR code up here is that I was fortunate enough to do a webinar series around courageous leadership before we published the book, and Louisa was one of our guests. So if you want to access that webinar, you can check out the QR code here. 2 other courageous leaders that talk about vision are Rob Friel and Brian Cromer from Southwestern School District in Pennsylvania. And they've identified in this, exploration phase, we have to have a common vision. We have to make a plan. We have to start with the end in mind. Think about what you want your school or district to look like in 5 years and create the strict structure, systems, and replicable routines to hold up that vision. So I was, again, fortunate enough to speak with them in a podcast. So if you're interested in listening to these 2 amazing leaders, you can access the podcast here. Another set of leaders that I had the opportunity to engage in a webinar, and again, you can access it here, Danielle Thompson, you might know Dr. Nell, and Terry Noland. And I love number 2, what they say is, leadership isn't a position, it's a disposition. And I love that. And you might know, by the way, Nell. She's the founder of the Transformative Reading Teacher Group. And she also holds a Big Sky Literacy Conference every year. And I just have to put a plug in for it. This year's focus for Big Sky is language, and you do not want to miss that. She also has her opening day. She calls it her Transformation Day. She has a guest. His name is Bruce Perry. He's the author of What Happened to You. And I think he'll be a tremendous speaker to open that wonderful conference. They talk about leader wobbles in their work. Terry and Nell do a lot of work across the country. They do a 6-day course on literacy leadership transformation. And this is just an example of what they mean by leader wobbles. For example, a leader wobble is believing that leaders do not have to know about how to teach reading, but a leader move is making sure that you understand how children learn to read. Yeah. So I just wanted to share with you what they meant by leader wobbles, and leader moves. Okay. So that's just a glimpse at that idea that the first thing we have to do is create a shared vision. Another thing that happens in the implementation phase, excuse me, exploration phase, is that we build an implementation team, but in actuality, we need more than just an implementation team in our buildings. We need leadership teams who can do all of these things, who can lead, for example, the policies, allocate resource, focus on data. The implementation team are 3 to 7 members who represent diverse experiences and perspectives in your school, made up of a lot of your early adopters, your willing partners, those champions. The implementation team is designed to meet regularly, to disseminate information to the greater school body, and communicate to bring challenges to the forefront as you go on this journey of implementation. Now, the implementation teams, though, do not handle what we need to handle in our grade level intervention teams, because that's where we really get into the data and drive those instructional decisions, collaborate for that continuous learning, and ensure that all of our students get consistent, high quality educational experiences across all classes and grade levels. Now, this last one I mentioned, the grade level teams, is really about collaboration. And I want to mention in the second phase of installation, you've started, you're moving into the installation phase, you're securing buy-in, you're developing your plan, you're gathering data, you're starting some training, but you're also collaborating. And we know that, and this is in the Courage to Lead, why do we need to collaborate? Think about the diverse experience, expertise, and perspectives that can come to the table and foster that continuous learning and supportive learning environment. So it's really important that we look at this again as a collaborative problem-solving process, right? And as we're doing that, we are creating that implementation plan. So we've set the stage with the exploration phase. Now we're really building a plan. And this is an all hands on deck endeavor, because we want our literacy planning, which we go into in the Courage to Lead. We kind of provide a blueprint for that. We have to act with a sense of urgency. We have to elevate, especially in the first 2 phases of an implementation journey, how important this is. And we do that by looking at data. From there, we want to implement our MTSS plan, multi-tiered systems of support. And I always like to remember this, that multi-tiered systems of support is not just about intervention for those students who are below benchmark. It's also extension and enrichment for our students who are above benchmark. And we want to utilize the strongest specialists with the students who need the most time, intensity, and focus of instruction. And finally, we want to make scheduling a priority so that students have the instruction they need. I'm wondering if any of you follow Emily Hanford and her APM reporting. She recently, in her most recent APM report, she profiled Steubenville, Ohio. And one of the things she talked about is their consistent use of a walk to read model, where the students are getting exactly what they need during their small group reading time. So if you're not familiar with Emily Hanford and APM reporting, check that out. She's done a series of reporting over the last few years that, frankly, I think have elevated the conversation around reading and the science of reading to the general public. So I borrowed this from my friend Stephanie Stoller. Basically, what do we mean by MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support? We find out what the kids need, we provide it in the regular classroom, and we intensify supports as data indicates. Now, what we mean by this is then looking at tiers of instruction. And I use this graphic a lot to explain what we mean by tiers of instruction. I'm guessing most, if not all of you tuning in tonight are totally with me on this. When we talk about tiers of instruction, tier 1 is core, designed for all of our students. Tier 2 is intervention, and it's a subset of our students in core instruction who need more time, more intensity, which means a smaller group and a deliberate focus, targeted instruction as designed through data. And of course, tier 3 are students who need the most time, intensity, and focus of instruction. That's our intensive intervention group. So we want to make sure as we're structuring our literacy plan that we're taking into consideration how do we provide a system that is supporting all these tiers of instruction. Okay, what else are we doing to support those tiers of instruction in that installation phase where we're gathering the data that we need to drive that instruction? And that data is also helpful in us making the case that transformation will need to happen to meet our goals, reach our vision that all means all. So this is just designed as kind of a quick guide to the different types of assessments we need. Obviously, we need a universal screener for everyone. It's that brief assessment of standardized skills. And kind of an analogy to the medical model would be when you go into your clinic or to your general practitioner and they take your vital signs. Now, if your vital signs indicate something's amiss, then you need some diagnostics. And that's what happens with our students. Now, in the case of intervention, these would be our students that score below benchmark. We want to deeply assess their skills and determine why the intervention is necessary. So the universal screener is the who, the diagnostic is the why. And this is if we, for example, in the medical model, need additional testing or screening. Progress monitoring is we need to do this very frequently to keep our kids out of this cul-de-sac of intervention, I like to call it. And progress monitoring is really about if what we're doing is working. It's not so much about the kids. It's about if what we are doing is working. And then, of course, we all have outcome evaluations that really is like the overall health of our school or district. So when we think about those different types of assessment, if we put it in the instructional cycle, I think it makes a lot of sense. And we're using this with permission from Deb Glazer and Jan Hasbrook. We want to deliver that Tier 1 instruction to all of our students and identify the kids who are at risk. Once we know our kids who are at risk, we're to determine those individual needs and plan that instruction, implement that plan, monitor their progress, and then make changes or continue the plan. The assessments that come into play, again, the who, that's our universal screeners for everyone. The what and the why come in when we use the diagnostic assessments with our students who are at risk. And then, of course, gauging the impact of our instruction comes through that progress monitoring. And all of these need to be in place. Now, even though my model here is really more about students in Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention, remember, you're also going to screen and identify those kids who need extension and enrichment as well. Okay, all right, moving along. Now, again, this is an overview we're doing tonight. So I know I'm going pretty quickly. I'm moving it up, as Anita Archer would say, a perky pace. But I want to give you kind of an overview of the richness of the content in this text. So the initial implementation is really where we're getting to the root of this collaborative problem-solving process. And in the book, we use this graphic to kind of illustrate that the steps in collaborative problem solving involve first, gathering data, second, analyzing and goal setting from the data. You know, one of the things that many people report to me when I work in schools and districts is we got a lot of data. We got a lot of data. We're doing tons of assessments, but we're not taking it to those next stages, which are analyzing, goal setting, acting on those goals, noticing if those goals that we've set and our actions are having the impact we want, and then making that adjustment, again, through collaborative problem solving. And this is so important that we're doing this together because, again, we don't want there to be any sort of a blame game going on. We want this to be all of our kids. We're all in this together, working toward the betterment for all of our kids. So to put it really simply, in a collaborative problem-solving model, we assess, we analyze, we instruct. We assess, we analyze, we instruct. Right? All right, good. So also in this initial implementation phase is when we really are deeply moving into our professional learning. We've probably explored back in the exploration phase what would be the best way for us to both train and sustain this implementation or this innovation, and how do we best support our teachers. So in the Courage to Lead, we provide kind of a little checklist for professional learning because we want to, in professional learning, think big. right? Professional learning is not a sit and get. Professional learning is building a culture of curiosity and learning. You know, one of the things about our profession that I love so much is that we're a profession of inquiry and we're a profession of self-reflection and curiosity. So to do that, we want to make sure that our professional learning is focusing on evidence-aligned principles of instruction, that our professional learning reflects what we currently know. Because remember, the science of reading is not static, it's dynamic. It's a dynamic body of research. And along with that current research and practice comes an attention to culturally relevant pedagogy based on principles of adult learning, by which we know a lot, of which we know a lot. And that staff members don't just get training, and I kind of don't love that word, because professional learning is really about ongoing learning, and we need coaching to really translate that. And as a profession, I think this is something that we really have to elevate and commit to, right? Other checklist items here. Um, you know, every teacher's a reading teacher. I was recently writing a chapter for a book on adolescent literacy, and it really comes down to that. All of us have to be reading teachers. You know, we have many of our students in the middle, upper, even secondary grades who are struggling. And so these are principles of instruction and principles of research that all of us need to know on an ongoing and long-term basis. And we have to have communities to be able to reflect on our practice in courageous conversations, right? And again, as Terry and Nell said about a leader wobble is thinking you don't have to know this stuff, but a leader move is knowing that you can learn about the science of reading and the science of learning as well. And I want to elevate that just for a moment because, you know, when we think about the sciences that inform our practice, it isn't just the science of reading. It's also the science of learning and the science of teaching. So for example, when we think about some of those evidence-aligned principles, we want our instruction to be explicit and systematic, cumulative review, sequential instruction, active engagement for our students, data-driven instruction. And we also want to make sure that we have coherence and alignment across all tiers of instruction. Now, hold that thought for a minute. I'm going to get to that in a second. All of these principles are the things that we need to make sure to hold close when we construct our professional learning, right? There's professional learning around lots of different things, but how do we hold close to some of these really important principles that all of us need to know and understand and put into practice? So that's the, you know, kind of science of reading principles, but what about science of learning? Well, some of you are familiar with Deans for Impact. And if you're not, I encourage you to check out their website, Deans for Impact. They have created a book called The Science of Learning, and they really do review for us what we mean by the science of learning. Like, what do we know about the process of learning? And many of these principles overlap with what we know from best practices in structured literacy, which is a manifestation of the science of reading. So principle one is all about review, you know, and the practice, how that manifests in practice is having our lessons deliberately connect the known to the new. So starting our lessons, their I do, we do, you do lessons, start with review. Another principle is this idea of learning load. We know that learning can be impeded if our students are confronted with too much information at once. And so how that manifests into practice is lessons are sequential, gradual release, I do, we do, you do, and they include repeatable, replicable routines. A third learning science principle is that students always need to really focus on meaning, and that's why a practice of that is ensuring that our lessons are clearly defined, and if they're skill lessons, that we're making sure that those skills are applied in reading and writing. Another principle of learning is that practice is important, and we need to make sure we have all kinds of practice, guided, independent, and interleaved practice. A fifth principle is that effective feedback is really critical when we're trying to learn a new skill or increase our knowledge base. And so as we work with our students, we provide targeted and specific practice, feedback in their practice. And finally, our students, of course, need to be environments where they feel safe and valued. And that's where you're the heart of the teacher. We can talk about the art of teaching, but that's where your heart of a teacher comes into play. And I will also say, instructionally, ensuring our students experience success, incremental steps of success, which is why sequential cumulative instruction and explicit instruction is critically important. That's what really builds that motivating environment. So the reason I kind of bird walked off of this, but I wanted to make sure when we think about professional learning that we're focused on the sciences, the science of reading, the science of learning, the science of teaching, and the implementation science. All of those really dovetail together in almost a multiplicative way to really advance our understanding of the best practices for our students. Many of you probably have seen this, and this is basically, I've recreated this in the Courage to Lead on page 33. This is the Joyce and Showers research that reiterates what we know, that if our professional learning is all theory, there isn't a lot of transfer to practice. If it's demonstration, we're increasing our knowledge level, but again, not much transfer. If we, in our professional learning settings, are allowed to practice new strategies and new routines, for example, there's more transfer, but it's really the coaching that makes a huge difference in changing our practice. So investing in coaching is critically important. Okay, so just kind of looking here, in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of quickly move through this, because in the Courage to Lead, one of the things I like to think about is in the professional learning, and we spend quite a bit of time thinking about professional learning in this book. In professional learning, how do we differentiate? How do we think about what teachers need to know, what coaches need to know, what principals need to know, what district administrators need to know, so that we have a through line of professional learning around literacy, but that we specialize that through line in order to make sure we're meeting the needs of all the different players in our implementation journey. Okay, so initial implementation is also the time when we're making sure our resources are in place. In other words, our curriculum materials are in place. So when we think about the resources, here's some tips and advice that I would offer you. First of all, we want to hold high standards for efficacy and evidence. Efficacy means that there's research that shows that these resources that we're going to use work with real teachers, real kids in real classrooms. And then evidence, again, is alignment to that science of reading, science of learning, the sciences. Sometimes this is the hardest part of adopting a new resource. Sometimes we have to pull weeds to plant flowers. Sometimes we have to, if we're adopting something new, we can't just add on to what we're currently doing. We have to make way, right? Because more doesn't mean better. Sometimes we have to streamline our resources to really make sure that we have the efficiency of instruction. And I also think that we want to make sure that, of course, those resources are pedagogically aligned across all tiers of instruction. And by alignment, these are the things: are they aligned in academic language? Are they aligned in skills and scope and sequence of skills? Do all of our resources have similar high impact routines? That allows our students to focus their cognitive energy on the content and not on the routine itself. And replicable, repeatable routines are great for us as teachers, because it allows us to know that my lesson plan is going to start with review. I do, we do, you do. We know the types of practice that are going to be replicable and repeatable. We know we're going to use high impact routines like word chains and sound spelling mapping, so we can then focus our cognitive energy on our students and less on the lessons and the material. And finally, alignment across tiers also means that data alignment. And that data alignment includes visibility. Just everyone who needs to know, we're all in this together. It's collaborative problem solving. Do we all have visibility into the data? I mentioned Emily Hanford, and one of the things she said about curriculum resources is she said, Not a lot of publishers do curriculum resource efficacy studies because they're expensive and they don't get studied. But I want you to know I'm very proud. At 95% group, we invest in efficacy studies because we want to make sure that what we're putting out into the world actually has proven results. So if you're interested more about our efficacy studies here at 95% group, here's our little QR code here. And I love one of my contributors was Mitchell Brookins, and I love what he had to say about curricular resources. I'll let you go ahead and read his words of wisdom here. All right, and again, he's another person that I was fortunate enough to be in conversation with in our webinar series. So if you're interested in revisiting that webinar, there's a QR code for that here. All right, very good. So in full implementation, one of the things we want to make sure that a hallmark of full implementation is that we're skillfully using that innovation. We're skillfully using that intervention. And as leaders, we're inspecting what we expect to be happening. We're also thinking about how do we maintain a culture of curiosity and innovation. So in the Courage to Lead, I've kind of identified what are some indicators of our healthy school culture that really will uphold innovation, curiosity, and striving toward the practice and the goals that we've identified early on. So we want to have collaborative teams that are engaged in problem solving, opportunities to review and reflect and revise. We have to be open to new ideas and following different paths if what we're doing isn't working. That requires us to evaluate our student outcomes consistently. Engagement, our students engaged, that's a hallmark of a healthy culture. And is there a pervasive sense of joy in the culture that we have created? Sometimes I think the conversation around reading it gets a little too tactical around some of the practices in the science of reading or structured literacy, but let's never forget that we want our students to be joyfully literate and flourishing as literate citizens. Okay. And speaking of reflecting, in the Courage to Lead, I offer some opportunities for us to think about, how do we reflect on this implementation journey? Are we constantly reflecting to see, are the outcomes that we've established at the beginning of the journey during that exploration phase, are we meeting those outcomes? And are we still engaged? Are we still thriving? We reflect on what shifts need to be made. What are the next steps we need to take? And identify specific questions that we can ask ourselves as leaders. Are we seeing the change that we want? Are the right people in the right seats rowing in the same direction? Do we have the right assessments giving us the data we need? And have we invested in the right resources or the right materials to get results? Have we carved out adequate time for our MTSS model? And is the professional learning and coaching having the desired effects? How am I thinking forward about what my teachers might need for their next step? And finally, am I building sustainability? Sometimes when a leader leaves or when someone who's a champion for change is no longer a champion for change, many of our efforts will fall by the wayside. And so that's why sustainability is really about securing that long-term commitment and that continued growth. And by doing one of the main things we have to remember as leaders is that, we're not great because of our power. We're great because of the ability to empower others. Okay. Who are you building up? Who are you empowering? Who are you providing training and coaching and support for? Who's going to take your place? These are all questions that courageous leaders ask his or herself. All right, very good. So as we wrap up, I want you to think about three things. What resonated with you today in our time together? What questions still remain? What is your next best step? Think about one of those questions and drop something in the chat, something that resonated with you, a question you still have, or your next best step. So drop something in the chat for me. What resonated with you? What questions do you have? Am I building sustainability? I think that's a huge question. Casey, thank you. Yeah, how do we, yeah, how do we nurture that caring and commitment for all of our students? The equation of effectiveness, that's a question you have to go back to that. Good. And again, my whole purpose tonight was just to kind of overview the big picture for you so you can go back in and dig more deeply into some of these. Um, Pulling of weeds need to be planned carefully with everyone involved collaboratively. You know what I wanted to, Kathy, I'm going to say something about that. Somebody asked me last night when I was doing a talk, why is change so hard? And I think as humans, change is sometimes difficult. But one of the reasons is because many of us as teachers have seen success with what we're doing. And so we don't want to try anything different because it might not be as successful, right? Maybe what we've done has worked for some, has worked for maybe most of my kids. So I don't want to give that up because what I'm going to do next may not have those same results. So we really have to think about how are our early adopters in this implementation journey showing success as models for others, because I am of the firm conviction as teachers that when we see something work with our kids, that is the game changer for us. Yeah. Yeah, starting conversations. Yeah, we have to dig into that. Like, how do we start those courageous conversations? Yeah. How do we empower others? Yeah. The process resonated. Thank you, Marcy. I appreciate that. Somebody mentioned Stephanie Stoller's MTSS course. Absolutely. There you go. Perfect. She's my go-to. She is the expert on MTSS. And anything she has to say and her teaching on MTSS to me is incredibly powerful. So thank you for all those comments. So again, I just want to make sure that you have access to this. I think Barbara's put it in the chat for you. We've had the QR code. One of the things that we're trying to do is elevate this idea that we have a blueprint for change that will allow us to make it happen, right? Like we can't just sit back and hope it will happen or passively let stuff happen. Like we have to courageously move forward and make change happen. And this will hopefully be a helpful resource for you. So as we wrap up tonight, here's my contact information. Should you like to reach out to me with any follow-up questions or comments, please do. Also, this is contact information for our wonderful account executives here at 95% Group, and they can answer all your questions about our professional learning, our products, and they're wonderful literacy experts in their own right. So if you're interested in more about 95% Group, here's your people to ask and in contact with. So thank you all for this time. Again, I'm very humbled every time we get a chance to do one of these because I know each of you has already put in a very busy day, and I appreciate the time that you spend with us. And I hope that this has been helpful to you in some way. Maybe it's been affirming. Maybe there's some new ideas that you want to explore. And regardless, I wish you all well. I wish you all a wonderful evening. And thank you again for joining us. We appreciate you. It's our honor to support you. Take care. Thanks, everybody.